on property tax exemptions from Legislative Post-Audit Committee. I do know that you will be interested in this. Thank you, Sam and Kristen. You guys are always, we got two Kristens in the room today. So Sam, welcome to the Tax Committee, and we look forward to your information.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, committee. My name is Sam Dadds. I'm a senior auditor with Legislative Post-Audit. Today, I'm presenting our audit titled Reviewing Tax-Exempt Real Property and Property Donated to Universities. So this audit was a two-question audit. Question one was, what was the estimated amount of foregone property tax revenue to state and local governments in 2024 due to property tax exemptions? Question two was, how much real property has been donated to the 7 Kansas public universities and their foundations and is exempt from property taxes? So question one is found on page 4. The answer to that's on page 4 along with some background information. In 2024, real property tax exemptions resulted in counties foregoing an estimated $1 billion in tax revenue and the state foregoing about $12 million in tax revenue. Brief background. The Kansas Constitution defines 2 classes of property for taxation. That's real property and personal property. We are talking about real property in this audit. We're going to jump ahead to pages 6 and 7 and take a look at Figure 2. Figure 2 shows the major sources of tax revenue in Kansas for 2024. The blue bar on the left of Figure 2 shows that property taxes were a significant source of revenue for the state and local governments when compared to other sources of tax revenue. It was about 31% in 2024. However, about 99% of the property tax revenue goes to local governments. And what that means is that local governments will forego the most revenue from property tax exemptions. So on pages 7 and 8, you'll find a description of how we group the 64 exemption statutes that we reviewed for this audit. In Appendix A, we list the statutes included in each group. We'll move ahead to page 9 of the report. So the information in page 9 is important because it describes the programs that aren't included in this audit. And in particular, we didn't review other economic development incentives like tax increment finance districts, or reinvestment housing incentive districts, community improvement districts, and the neighborhood revitalization program. So these programs are also described in more detail on page 9. We didn't include these incentive programs because they're not tax exemptions. These programs are administered also by local governments, which means there's no centralized statewide data on them. Instead, each county and city maintains information for each incentive program. So page 10 describes our methods, and to keep the methods brief, these types of analyses require substantial assumptions about assessment rates and mill levies for exempt property because these properties aren't used for taxable purposes. And that means data aren't available about how these properties should be assessed. What that means is, as an example, it's not clear what the assessment rate for a church would be if it wasn't used, if it wasn't tax exempt, because we don't know what it would be used for if it wasn't used for a church. So what we did for this audit is we reviewed county property tax records for all Kansas counties and Department of Revenue reports for 2024 to calculate an average assessment rate and an average mill levy for each county based on their taxable property. And then we use those averages to estimate the foregone revenue in each county based on the exempt property's value. We did this to help control for the different property distributions across the state. The only properties this method differed for were for IRBX and EDX properties. For those, we assumed a 25% assessment rate because that's the rate for commercial and industrial property. Now, this assumption is different than the assumption used for the material submitted by KLRD to the Special Tax Committee back in, I believe, November. So if we used a universal assessment rate of 25% and the state average mill levy like KLRD did, it would increase our estimates by about $700 million, and we'd be much closer to KLRD's estimate. So the assumptions that you use matter. Finally, we used KDOR's reports to account for fees such as payments in lieu of taxes that some taxpayers may pay on their real property that partially offset the revenue loss from the property tax exemptions. So figure 5 on page 13 shows how much property tax was exempt in each county in 2024 as a percentage. There were 4 counties with exemption rates greater than 30% that stood out to us. In most cases, those high exemption rates were due to large federal exemptions such as Fort Riley and Riley County. If you're interested in more information about the counties, you can see Appendix B. It shows our foregone revenue estimates and exempt rates by county in 2024. Now, pages 15 and 17, that's where we discuss some important caveats to this audit. The most important caveat being that the reason we couldn't analyze the property data by exemption type is that county records store information about all exempt and taxable real property in Kansas. And in these records, county appraisers are supposed to record why the property is exempt using an exemption code. So during the audit, we tried to analyze the exemption data provided by KDOR using these exemption codes. However, real property exemption codes in the data provided by KDOR were sometimes missing, inconsistent, or incorrect. And that means they're not reliable enough for us to estimate the foregone revenue by exemption type. And these codes were, we use these codes for analysis. They present incorrect summaries of property tax exemptions. So as one example, about 7% of the total exempt properties statewide had a blank exemption code in the county data that was provided by KDOR. And what that means is we can't determine why these properties were tax exempt. There are other examples in this section of the report if you'd like to read more about this issue. The examples in the report are not exhaustive. So the issues with the exemption codes appear to be caused by systemic problems that may not be feasible for KDOR and county appraisers to resolve. So the process for assigning property tax exemption codes involves multiple systems and entities, and that includes KDOR, the Board of Tax Appeals, or BOTA, and county appraisers. So like we said, in Kansas, the county appraisers document the tax exempt real property using the same real property software across the state. And within the software, they assign exemption codes to properties that describe why the properties are tax exempt. KDOR defines those codes. The codes are then defined based on statutes. And what that means is in most cases, groups of statutes should fall under one code. When an entity seeks a property tax exemption, they must file an application with BOTA. BOTA reviews the statutes cited on the exemption application and approves the exemption if the property meets the criteria found in statute. BOTA then sends the approved exemption orders to the county appraiser, and those orders include the statutory citation for the exemption. Ideally, the county appraiser should reference the statute in those orders and code the property according to KDOR's code definitions. However, there are problems with this system. So number one, property may qualify for more than one exemption, which leads to similar properties being granted exemptions under different statutes. So as one example, we saw some university properties were coded as exempt educational. However, for the same university, they also had properties that were coded as exempt state. If we were to analyze by these codes, the same university property would end up under 2 different coding categories. 2, KDOR's codes sometimes share the same statute. That means a few exemption statutes are included in more than one code, which can create confusion for county appraisers. 3, counties may disregard BOTA orders and KDOR codes. So during this audit, we saw some county appraisers add to or change the codes in their county level systems. We also found one example of a property that had a wrong exemption code and statutory citation when we compared it to BOTA's exemption order. That property had been coded incorrectly for over 30 years. Number 4, there are no monitoring processes in place to ensure that county appraisers and their staff assign consistent and accurate codes. So that means once they're coded in the system, they remain that way. And 5, if these problems were corrected today for all future property tax exemptions, it doesn't fix the historical coding issues that have happened in the past. So what all of this means together is that if one analyzes by these codes today, the results wouldn't accurately reflect how much tax revenue state and local governments didn't collect due to a type of exemption. And that's why we're presenting you with an overall amount that state and local governments didn't collect in 2024. So for this audit, we also have some other findings that start on page 17. The first of those is that we found some issues with KDOR's statistical report of property assessment and taxation. That report was missing appraised value information for some IRBX and EDX properties. We also identified 2 exemptions in state law that may be outdated. The first referred to a repealed statute that exempts the docking state office building from property taxes. And the second was a statute that exempts the Kansas Bioscience Authority from property tax. Bioscience Authority being privatized about 10 years ago. So we didn't do a comprehensive review of statutory language for each property tax exemption. And that means it's possible there may be additional exemptions that are outdated. And this is important because these outdated exemptions may add to the exemption code issues that we identified, and may also allow entities to apply for exemptions that aren't intended by the legislature. So very quickly, going through question 2. Question 2 begins on page 18 with some background information, just to refresh. Question 2 asked how much real property had been donated to the 7 Kansas public universities and their foundations and is exempt from property tax. About 98% of the appraised value of Kansas's 7 public universities and their foundations' real property was exempt from property tax in 2024. But we don't know how much of that real property was donated to universities because most universities don't keep that information. So very quickly on page 20, we describe some of our methods and limitations to this question if you're interested in reading about those. On page, figure 6 on page 21, we'll show you how much real property universities and their foundations owned in 2024 in terms of appraised value. That's for taxable and exempt property. Together, all 7 universities and foundations owned about $4.5 billion in real property in 2024. Kansas State University and the University of Kansas own the most property along with their foundations. That was about 74% of that $4.5 billion. And on page 22, you'll see that of that $4.5 billion, $4.4 billion was tax exempt. Universities own 97% of that tax exempt property. Foundations own the last 3%. Figure 9 on page 25 shows how the foundations reported acquiring their real property, if you're interested in that. And Appendix C and D has additional information about each university, including where they own the property in Kansas, and limited information about how they reported acquiring it. And finally, if you're interested, there's some additional information about other types of real property universities and foundations owned on page 26. So for this audit, we had 2 recommendations, the first being for the Kansas Department of Revenue, and that's KDOR should include the values for new industrial revenue bond and economic development property tax exemption codes in the totals they report in the statistical report of property assessment and taxation. Generally, KDOR should ensure that the statistical report correctly compiles all relevant information and that the totals presented in the report are accurate representations of the exempt values of property in the state. The second recommendation was for the legislature's consideration, and that's the legislature should consider reviewing exemption statutes and eliminating ones that are outdated. And this could include the 2 exemptions discussed in this report. So with that, that's the conclusion of my presentation, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Sam. Committee questions? I do have one. I find it interesting on page 9, the list of exemptions that were not included in this audit. Do you have any idea of what number we would be looking at?
In terms of how many properties would be flagged under those exemptions?
And dollar amounts?
We don't, in terms of dollar amount. I think half of those aren't even included in the property data, and the other half, it's not clear how much of that, what portion of the property would be included under, for example, TIF.
Okay. So I guess, any other questions for Sam? Senator Starnes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not a question, other than just a comment and seeing with Kansas State and the amount of exemptions there. And the legislative research provided us information this summer as far as total amount of exemptions, federal, state, local, all exemptions. In Riley County, our tax exemption loss per person is $13,000, almost $600 that everyone's having to make up in our county prior to ever starting with the other taxing budgets. So the next closest was Johnson County at 5,600. So very unique to Riley County and to our constituents.
So thank you, Senator. Many of these are also by constitution and other, we don't have a lot of wiggle room there, but if there's no other, Senator Schellenberger.
Thank you. In your research, did you determine what all this foundation property is used for? I mean, if I'm a businessman, I own a coffee shop and I die and my widow wants to donate the coffee shop to Pittsburgh State, can they get that exempted?
So
Does that happen?
sure. So I think what you're asking, there's maybe two different questions there. So as far as the foundations, if somebody donates their property to the foundation, if the foundation uses it for a tax exempt purpose, they have to go through the BOTA process and get approval for a tax exemption. Otherwise, it's taxable property and they have to pay taxes on it. During our audit work, we found that the foundations tend to own taxable property. They own a lot of taxable agricultural land. As far as the university, same process applies. Just because it's a university doesn't mean the property is automatically tax exempt. They have to use it for a tax exempt purpose, and that has to go through the BOTA approval process before it's taken off the tax rolls.
Any other? Thank you, Sam. So, Bob, I hate to put you on the spot, but would you mind on page 9, and you guys, if you don't know, Bob Kent, the director of PVD, is doing a great job, especially I ask a lot of questions and Bob knows it. So is there any chance that you could put a report together for this committee that shows what type of dollar amount we're looking for these programs, like the CID, the TIF, the ones that were not included in this report?
Yeah, first of all, Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Bob Ken. I'm with the Division of Property Evaluation. Is this the same report that was requested in Legislative Post-Audit Committee?
It is, probably, I thought she just asked for TIF, but I would like to get all of them if we could. So it would be a very similar report, yes.
Yeah, we're working on it. Matter of fact, it should be done today, but it will include IRBs and TIFs.
Okay. And if
We
we
don't
could-
have any information on CIDs.
Don't.
And
That's
we
local.
just implemented our exemption codes or the process for the RHIDs this summer, and it just went out in the 2026 tax year. So we don't have any information on that yet either.
Okay. It's probably not something research or anybody could get then if you guys don't have it. The RHIDs, the CID.
I would assume as those start filtering through, there
Did we
may
get
be,
past year, maybe a.
there may be some out there.
Okay.
We'll see what comes.
I just want the committee, and I've looked at these reports pretty extensively, and I want them to get an idea, the number of parcels and the dollar amounts that have been exempted by their local governments. So that's just what I'm looking at here. Senator Francisco.
Madam Chair, if you're finished, I have a question, I think that might be able to be answered on a slightly different topic. And that's when we heard about the issue of a property that would be able to be categorized in more than one category. So certainly the universities have education and they also have state-owned property. Is there any way that there could be a system that's hierarchical, that you say if it's, state-owned, then it first goes there? It seems awkward to ask individual county appraisers to make a choice between categories.
That's a tough question because It's possible. I mean, anything's possible. What would be ideal is if we could, take those exemption statutes and create a type code for each one of them, but that's a systematic change, like Sam alluded to, and it would be a very long list. But, with some coaching, I think we could, maybe implement something. But again,
Thank you. It seems like a good place to start would be just with the universities because there's a great amount and just maybe some advice as to whether that should be classified as state-owned property or educational.
Yeah, it looks like committee, we have some work to do on our exemption codes and on our sales tax exemptions on quite a bit of the tax code. It's,
one of the recommendations was for us to update IRBs and EDX, or IRBs and the economic development properties in the stat book. But I think we're going to do what we can to work with the counties. We're going to, Sam talked about the codes that we're missing. The codes are missing because there's not an exemption page for it. So we can exempt, at the property level, we can exempt the parcel. It doesn't have to have an exemption page. They all should have an exemption page. And that exemption type is on that exemption page, and that's why those are missing. One of our things we will work with the county on is that very thing, so.
yeah, I do know of a county that a previous county appraiser had property off the books, and it was just exempted because they chose to exempt it. There wasn't any statute or anything. They should have been on the books. But so the system, yeah, it's a big system. It's got a lot of issues. We're working on it. It's not going to be fixed overnight, but I know you guys are taking a look at it too. Bob, if you could break that report down by county, that'd be great.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you very much, Bob. Committee will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the BOTA budget. Jacob, welcome to the Tax Committee. I think it's your first time, isn't it, with this committee?
Yes, Madam Chair. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jacob Klesby, and I am the fiscal analyst from KLRD assigned to the Board of Tax Appeals. Beside me in the audience is the chair of the agency's board, Kristen Wheeler, and the executive director of the agency as well, and they are prepared to stand and answer any additional questions. In front of you, you should have 3 documents. The first is the updated version of the KLRD budget summary for the Board of Tax Appeals. In addition to this, you should have a one-page document with mainly blue headings. This represents the LBC's recommendations for the agency. And you will also have an additional yellow sheet, and that is the governor's recommendation for the budget. So beginning on page 1 of the budget summary, this page presents an executive summary which lists the mission of the Board of Tax Appeals, or BOTA, is to resolve disputes between taxpayers and taxing authorities promptly and impartially, and to help maintain public confidence in state and local tax systems. Continuing the information on this page, there are expenditures by fiscal year and version through fiscal year 2024 through fiscal year 2027. And at the bottom of page 1, you will see 2 pie charts. This illustrates the Board of Tax Appeals expenditures as part of the State General Fund. The Board of Tax Appeals has $1.5 million of SGF, which makes up less than 1% of all SGF spending. And the total expenditures for the Board of Tax Appeals in their budget are $2.7 million, which makes up less than 1% of all other state spending. Turning to page 3 of the document, you will see a 10-year expenditure history of the agency represented in a line graph. The table below the line graph on page 3 provides numerical numbers to these values. If you will see, the chart is broken into a green and blue line, blue indicating SGF and green indicating all funds. The table below, providing numerical values, highlights the expenditures by SGF, all funds, FTE positions, and the change percent for all these values. In addition, at the bottom of page 3, there is a table highlighting the 5-year change, 10-year change, and 3-year average of these values. Turning to page 4 of the document is a breakdown of expenditures by major purpose over the last 10 years of the agency. If you will notice, the only line changing on this graph is state operations represented in a dark blue color, while all other colors represent a flat line at the bottom. This indicates that no agency funds outside of state operations have been spent in the past 10 years. Moving to the chart, the second chart on page 4, this highlights expenditures by category within the agency. This is broken into salaries and wages, which makes up 77.8% of the state operation expenditures. 20.7 is dedicated to contractual services, 1.5 to commodities, and 0.1% dedicated to capital outlay. Turning to page 5, this provides a greater in-depth look at the same information under expenditures by classification. Under these broad categories of expenditures, it provides itemization for the different categories of expenditure. Turning to page 6 of the document is continuing this information, highlighting expenditures by program. If you will notice, 95.7% of the agency's expenditures are in administration, 3.5% is dedicated towards the Board of Tax Appeals modernization, and 0.8% is dedicated towards IT modernization projects. All FTE positions, which are highlighted in the table, the second table on page 6, are within the administration division of the agency. Turning to page 7 of the document, this highlights expenditures by fund. 55.1% of the agency's expenditures are from the State General Fund. 40.6% are from the Board of Tax Appeals Filing Fee Fund. A negligible percent is from the Duplicating Fee Fund, but the only expenditure in that fund last occurred in fiscal year 2024 and has not occurred in fiscal year 2025, nor is it projected to continue in 26 or 27. An additional 4.3% of agency funds is dedicated to federal funds, which is from the ARPA program. The second table on page 7 is a fee fund analysis of the Board of Tax Appeals Filing Fee Fund. This highlights fiscal years 2024 through 2027. If you will note, this highlights the beginning balance, the revenue for the fiscal year, expenditures, and then the ending balance at the end of the fiscal year. And if you will note, the ending balance of a fiscal year becomes the beginning balance of the next year. If you will turn to page 8, this highlights a fee schedule for the agency within fiscal year 2026. If you will note that only current fees are listed, which indicates that agency fees have not changed within the last 2 fiscal years. And if you will turn to page 9, this begins our analysis of fiscal year 2026. The approved amount by the 2025 legislature from SB 125 in fiscal year 2026 was $2.6 million, featuring $1.5 million SGF and 16 FTE positions. There is $7,000 of reappropriation from the State General Fund with a $104 lapse. In light of the motions made by the LBC, all reappropriations were frozen. So currently, this $7,000 for State General Fund reappropriations is removed from the budget. There are no supplemental requests in this year for the agency, and the only other change within the budget is on line item 4 in the table and continued in greater detail on line item 4 at the bottom of page 9. This is $117,000 of ARPA funds related to the agency's modernization project. This balance is the remainder of ARPA funding from fiscal year 2025, so no new funds are being requested by the agency. These are ARPA funds the agency has allocated for expenditure, but just has not spent yet, and they're asking for permission to spend the remaining ARPA balance before the program's conclusion this fiscal year. The agency modernization projects is dedicated towards one-time additional investments in hardware, software upgrades, database management, form overhaul and updating, and staff training not fully covered by prior expenditures. I'm happy to stand for questions on fiscal year 2026 or move to fiscal year 2027.
Questions on 26? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I wasn't quite prepared because a lot of agencies or a lot of committees just go from one year to the next fiscal year. On the Board of Tax Appeals, I would just note on page 3, 10-year change, 10% increase in state general fund expenditures, and the CPIU is 33%, so that is a threefold increase over inflation. That, Madam Chairman, is just a note, but I do have a question for our fiscal analyst. I don't know if you have an answer. If not, the agency will appear before us after a while. I notice on page 4, salaries and wages in 24, 1.7 million, and then the agency request in 27, 2.4 million, an increase of 400,000. Divide that by their 16 FTEs, that's $25,000 per FTE. Is there something, did they have some vacancies in 24, or can you explain why in just a short period of time a $25,000 salary increase?
Madam Chair, as for vacancies in fiscal year 2024, that is information I'll have to defer to the agency for precise information. I do know as of fiscal year 2025 and the current fiscal year 2026, all positions are filled within the agency. And in addition to that, staff attorney of 30 years is currently in the process of retiring, and they have hired a new attorney out of law school. Currently, they are going through a training process for the new attorney, similar to how executive directors of an agency will stay on as they train their replacement. So that current process is ongoing, which is attributable to the increase in salaries and wages as well. But as for other vacant positions attributing to that, that is information I will have to defer to the agency on.
I did notice that there is a request for 3 additional workers by the agency. Is that part of the 27 numbers, do you think?
Madam Chair, yes, that is part of the request in fiscal year 2027.
Senator Owen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to point out that the governor's recommendation sheet is not for this agency. This appears to be for the Kansas Department of Revenue. I've let staff know that, and they're going to be correcting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee, any other questions? Thank you, Jacob.
And Madam Chair, I do know the information from the governor's recommendation, if the agency would like me to explain as well.
Go ahead and go to 27 until we have the handout.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, if you will turn to page 10, this begins the analysis of fiscal year 2027. The Board of Tax Appeals is not a biennial agency, which means they do not have an approved amount yet for fiscal year 2027. This document uses the same fiscal year 2026 approved amount as a frame of reference, which once again is $2.6 million, featuring $1.5 million SGF and 16 FTE positions. The agency does feature 2 enhancement requests in this fiscal year, and in light of the LBC's recommendation, these enhancements were removed from the budget, and the governor also concurred with the LBC as well. In this enhancement request, the first being new FTE positions, which is what Senator Peck referenced, there is a request for 3 additional FTE positions: a legal assistant, administrative assistant, and taxpayer advocate. First, addressing the taxpayer advocate, the agency has communicated that this position will also be created within the Kansas Department of Revenue, and is willing to withdraw this from their enhancement request, bringing the total enhancement request down to 2 FTE positions. This has been presented before the House General Government Budget, and the House General Government Budget concurred with that request, allowing the first 2 FTE positions of the legal assistant and administrative assistant. The legal assistant has a total enhancement request of $50,000, featuring $27,000 of SGF, and the administrative assistant has an enhancement request of $53,000, including $29,000 SGF. In total, this does bring the enhancement request from for new FTE positions down from $207,000 to $104,000 and 2 FTE positions. The second enhancement request is market rate adjustments. This was also removed by the governor and LBC and the House General Government Budget Committee. The agency requests $33,000, including $18,000 in enhancement funding to increase the salaries of 3 existing staff attorney positions within the department. The agency indicates that this would bring compensation for these positions closer to respective market pay for similar state positions in other agencies with comparable workloads, with the intention of increasing their staff retention rates. The only other adjustment in fiscal year 2027 is under operating expenditures totaling $42,000, featuring $7,000 of SGF. The agency requests this spending from the Board of Tax Appeals filing fee fund. This is primarily attributable to increased spending on salaries and wages due to the retirement of the long-term staff attorney and training of new attorney. And additional increases in expenditures are attributable to software licenses and training of $12,000 that were previously covered by ARPA funding, in addition to contractual services for staff, continuing legal education, and additional training. That concludes fiscal year 2027. I'm happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Jacob. Committee, any questions? Seeing none. We're still waiting on the governor's document, the handout, but Kristen, would you like to address the committee? I'm sorry, Chairman Wheeler. I apologize. Welcome to the Tax Committee.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Kristen Wheeler. I am Chair of the Board of Tax Appeals, and with me is Jonathan Roberts, our Executive Director. I appreciate the opportunity to appear in front of you today to discuss the budget. I'd like to address Senator Peck's question first with respect to the salaries and wages for 2024 compared to 2027. Part of that increase was the legislative pay increase applicable to district court judges that also applied to BOTA's board members that is reflected in that salary increase. In addition, in 2024, we did have several vacancies. As I mentioned in my materials that I submitted over the past couple of fiscal years, we turned over 25% of our staff, which is 4 people, but with a total staff of 16, 4 is 25%, and several of those positions were vacant for quite some time, which you see in that 2024 salary number compared as well. So I think that those two things together, the pay increases, and that would also include the 5% pay increases for non-judicial staff, are all reflected in that, along with the request for what was 3 additional positions is now 2 additional positions for FY27. With respect to that taxpayer advocate position, I do apologize for the confusion, but the budget request was due before I testified in front of the interim committee in September. And at the time, we included the position as an example of what that would look like to fund that position within the agency. It wasn't until after we had to submit the budget that it became clear that that will likely be committed or be created in the Department of Revenue, so we are withdrawing that now, but do apologize for any confusion there. As far as the remainder of our budget, I tried to submit you materials that would address any questions that you all might have in advance so that I didn't take all of your time talking today. I would like to just draw the committee's attention to a couple of things. One thing that we addressed in the interim tax committee is just the caseload that BOTA has seen in the last couple of years. You'll note in my materials that an aggregate caseload, we went up from just under 7,700 cases in the last fiscal year to almost 8,400 this past fiscal year. That is a high since at least 2015. Our regular division cases were down somewhat, but you'll notice that the valuation appeals, the equalizations, and protests were up from the prior fiscal year, which indicates that we're getting a lot of residential appeals. And particularly, you can see how many more residential appeals we got in the small claims division, where we were up more than 1,000 cases in the last fiscal year. That caseload has caused us increasing difficulty with the speed with which we can process cases, and that is the basis for our request for the administrative assistant and the legal assistant, is to allow us to put some more resources toward getting those cases processed in a timely manner and providing the best level of service that we can provide to your constituents. Those 2 staffing requests that we have made, the administrative assistant and legal assistant, the total request for those is about $138,000. About $76,000 of that is state general fund, so 40% of it we are covering with the filing fee fund. I would just, again, draw the committee's attention back to my testimony before the interim tax committee and the other testimony that the interim tax committee heard back in the fall, where we talked in detail about how the Board of Tax Appeals used to have anywhere from 35 to 50 full-time positions. Caseloads have not substantially decreased since then. And where they did decrease, I think our low was about 6,500 cases in recent years. That was in FY 2022. We have now gone back up to 8,400 cases. And anecdotally, from what we're seeing recently, we're not seeing any kind of slowdown in the number of filings. I know that you all are considering a number of property tax reforms, and I have gotten questions on whether that would reduce our caseload. And the answer is it might in the future. It won't immediately. And we have cases in the pipeline that even if you enact property tax reforms that become effective in July, those cases, those thousands of cases currently in the pipeline will still be there waiting for a decision. Changes in the tax law could mean more appeals as people try to figure out how to interpret and apply those new rules. The short answer is that we don't know what the impact of those statutes would be immediately, and I am trying with our budget request to address the immediate need that we have to provide a better level of service. And with that, I would stand for any other questions.
Thank you. I do have a couple of questions for you. First off, I want to thank you, appreciate you working to try to improve the process over at BODA. I know you've been doing that extensively, and you're the one that brought us the idea of the taxpayer advocate. I think we're going to see a lot of results, but it will take time to stand up. I think it's smart that it's going under the Department of Revenue. Your software system, the new software, the system, and we've talked about other case management systems that are out there and available. This $100,000, would that allow you to look at case management systems to help improve the process also?
We are, that $100,000 that's left in ARPA funds is encumbered already for the project that we have implemented with OITS. It's not spent yet because that project has a number of milestone-based payments associated with it, and we are currently in the middle of implementation, so we haven't met some of those milestones yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So instead of increasing the legal by a person, if we use that money for software that would expedite the process, would that, I want you to think about it, don't answer it now, but think about it. I know administrative, you probably need that, but we need to find that balancing act, because I do think there's systems out there that could be very beneficial for you in the process and help what's going on over at BODA. I know you're slammed with cases. Committee, also, I did want to ask you, right now, it's mandatory for homeowners to go through small claims. Would legislation that address that, would that help alleviate, maybe allow mediators with, I know there's some language right now that allows it within counties, but if we would strengthen that language, maybe that could help you guys too.
If there was an option that allowed homeowners to opt out of that and go directly to the regular division, yes, I think what you would see then is we'd have a heavier caseload in regular division and less in small claims. I don't have figures in front of me. I could probably get you some numbers. In fact, I think that they're in our performance-based budget. It would just be a matter of figuring out what line items to compare of how many of the small claims decisions actually get appealed to the regular division. It does take a number out of the pipeline of people who get relief at small claims and then choose not to move forward. As far as whether there was some alternative outside of the BODA process, them to use maybe a mediator or have a county-wide sort of panel, then yes, that would take items out of our pipeline, but we would need to figure out how to allocate resources to make that process happen as well. I think those are probably good conversations to have, but require a lot more conversation.
Then 15 minutes. Committee, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you. Committee, if we have time, we'll work this tomorrow or Thursday, and then we'll hear the revenue budget tomorrow, and hopefully work it Thursday too. They've asked us to turn around very quickly on these. We do have a few minutes. I'd like to work Senate Bill 74. Amelia, will you give us an overview? Sure. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Senate Bill number 74 is from last year and the bill as introduced would have provided for a refundable income tax credit for expenditures for lockable gun and ammunition storage. The bill would establish an income tax credit for tax years 25 through 27 for a resident individual in an amount equal to 25% of the expenditures made by the individual during such tax year to purchase lockable gun and ammunition storage. The credit amount would not be allowed to exceed $250 per taxpayer. This was heard in this committee last year on February 13th. And when the bill was worked, there were 2 amendments made. One amendment had to do with the refundability, which was struck. And instead, there was language allowing for a carry forward of unused credit. So if there was unused credit, it could be carried forward until it was entirely deducted from tax liability. There was a second amendment in subsection A that clarified that the lockable gun and ammunition storage needed to be designed primarily for gun and ammunition storage. This bill was re-referred to the committee on January 12th of this year, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none. Committee, I do have an amendment, and I'm going to let Eddie, do you mind, do you want the list? I'm going to have Eddie speak to the list. What happened, committee, is for the last couple years, we've looked at tax credit programs that are no longer in use, haven't been used for 10, 15 years. It was recommended in an interim tax committee a couple years ago to sunset these, get them off the books. That would actually help with this legislation. I've been told on the fiscal note, you do have a handout committee. There's 3 handouts. You have the fiscal note for this bill. You have the actual bill and supplemental note, and then there's a list of the tax credit programs, 1 through 10. Do you want to? Sure. Thank you.
I'm actually gonna speak from Amelia's memo that she provided at the time. A bill was heard 2 years ago. That's Senate Bill 546 in the 2024 session. And that bill would have made some other changes to credits that are actively used and also made some rate changes. I'm only referring to a portion of that bill that was the repeal of certain unused tax credits. Senator Tyson asked me to take a look at that list. At that point in time, that bill had 7 tax credits that it repealed that were not used. Those were abandoned well plugging, agritourism liability insurance, assistive technology contributions, declared disaster capital investment, environmental compliance, the owners promoting employment across Kansas, and this is separate from the rest of the promoting employment across Kansas program, and the swine facility improvement credit. Those 7 credits had not, at that point in time, were not being used and had not been used for several years. Since that time, one of those credits, the abandoned well plugging credit, has had some credit claimed. And so I believe for purposes of the chair's amendment, that would be excluded from this list, so to speak. And we'll get a copy of this list to, because it is different than the list that was provided. So we'll get a copy of this updated list out to the committee, but I believe that is the list that the chair is kind of contemplating with her amendment here.
That is exactly what I'm looking for, Eddie. Thank you. We're not trying to take away any credit programs that are being used. These are just to get some off the books that we haven't seen. I know Department of Revenue, it's been very difficult keeping up with a lot of this stuff. And so if we can help them and help clean up the books, let's do it. So committee, I will make the motion to remove the tax credit programs listed that have not been used. So it would be excluding the plugging abandoned oil and gas well on your list. Is there a second on the motion? It's been moved by Senator Tyson, seconded by Senator Schallenberger. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Senator Peterson, would you like to move your bill? Is there any other discussion on on the bill? Senator, we'd entertain that motion to change. Yes. Is there a second? It's been moved by Senator Peterson, seconded by Senator Francisco. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, oh, Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So this basically puts a sunset on the credit?
Yes. Yes, we don't want any credits going out of here without a sunset anymore. So, thank you, Senator. All those in favor of the motion, say aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. We're back on the bill. Senator Peterson. Is there a second on the motion? It's been moved by Senator Peterson, seconded by Senator Corson. Discussion on the motion. Senator Peterson.
Just can't go by without saying it's a good time to pass gas because it's gun and ammunition storage.
Thank you, Senator. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. We'll get the bill. Hopefully, we'll see it across the floor. Committee, is there any other business to be brought before the committee? Seeing none, we're adjourned.